Last year. Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Last year, Betty Ford Alpine Gardens published a book, and it's all about the history of the gardens, and also for a lot of people they are not familiar with all the conservation work that we do here too. So I think it's not only a history of the gardens, explaining what alpine plants are, showing some of the absolute beautiful plants that we have in our gardens. We had had two professional photographers work with us, and so, you know, if you can order it on our website. So we're very proud of it. I think it did a good job explaining everything that's going on here at the gardens. So
well, I got one as a Christmas gift, and
good.
I just pour over it. It's
Yeah.
just lovely to look at. I recommend it to anybody in RMSBA.
Yeah, and if any of you have not visited Betty Ford Alpine Gardens, we specialize in alpine plants from all over the world. And of course, we're going to let you know what alpines really are. So maybe what we should do is get started on that.
Let's do it.
Okay. So let me share our screen.
Well, introduce yourselves first.
Oh, okay. All right,
yeah.
let's go back to us again. Anyway, we are, oh, I don't know what I did there. We're going to
Stop share.
Yeah. We are, I am Nanette Kuich. I'm the education director at Betty Ford Alpine Gardens.
And I'm Emily Griffoul. I'm the conservation scientist at Betty Ford Alpine Gardens. And yeah, we're really
good.
excited.
It's being recorded.
All right, we can get started, and please feel free to interrupt us if you have any questions while we go along. It's nice to have dialogue instead of all of you just sitting there passively listening to us blab away. So feel free. All right. Does that stay right there in the front of our?
You can move it down to like down
Okay.
or up or whatever.
Yeah, we'll just move it down. I'll go. All right, can you see our screen?
Yes.
All right, great. So we're going to talk about our talk is the disappearing alpine, because climate change is affecting the alpine ecosystem harder than any other ecosystem on the planet right now. But we want to make this talk about the positive things, what's really good about the alpine, and not worry about too much about the bad things, I think. So let's
Or spacebar.
this one down here, maybe. There we go. Okay, what is the alpine? The alpine is basically the land above where trees cannot survive. And alpine plants are specially evolved to take advantage of this wide open space that other plants cannot live in. It doesn't mean that they really live there because they like it. It's because they can survive, and they don't have to compete with the other plants. And we're also going to talk about our alpine strategy, our conservation work that we're doing here at the garden. So those will be the three top topics that we focus on. And I already said, what is the alpine? So it's the land above where trees cannot survive. And so what we have is, if you've looked up at the mountains, let's talk about the Himalayas, especially where there are glaciers on the tops of the mountains, and there are glaciers in Colorado too, by the way. So the alpine sits between where there's permanent ice and where there are trees. That is the alpine area. It covers about 3% of the land on the continents, and about 4% of all of the plants that have been identified. That's about 10,000 species. And what defines tree line? Generally, it's scientifically determined by a growing season that's less than 3 months long, and with a mean air temperature that's less than 6.4 degrees Celsius. And the reason that this description fits really well is because trees grow very slowly, and they need more than 3 months to get new growth out. And photosynthesis generally occurs at around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not sure what it is in Celsius off the top of my head. And so in order for those plants to even get started growing, they need a warm temperature above 40 degrees. Is it just this? There we go. And then here in Colorado, you can notice sometimes that we have our conifers in that tree zone, but then all of a sudden you'll see the trees change to juniper sage. And then even below where you have juniper sage, it can just turn into sagebrush. There'll be no trees at all. There's also a lower tree line, and that is just because there's not enough moisture for trees. You can see that trees are going to take a lot of water because they're pumping water all the way up from their roots, all the way up to the tops of those trees. And they lose a lot of water during the day. I don't know if you have heard, but something like some of the big trees, 10,000 gallons a day go through them. So it's pretty incredible. And where is the alpine? Well, the alpine is everywhere on our planet, all the way from the poles to the equator. I think a lot of people are surprised by that. But as you've probably noticed, here in Colorado, our tree line is about, what is it?
Like 11,200.
Somewhere around that. It all depends what the aspect to the sun is. But at the equator, it's, I don't know, about 14,500 or something like that. And down by the poles, it's right at sea level. So you can see that distribution, that green section that's on that graphic. And here in North America, the purple represents where alpine exists.
And this map actually is part of the Alpine strategy, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but it's one of the products of that document. So we're pretty excited about it.
It's very nice. I love the colors. And in the alpine, we've talked about the big description of it, but there are many, many little tiny niches where different plants have developed the ability to survive. And this photo shows you the different temperatures of this one alpine valley. So you have some plants that can live in those very cold green places, and then others that'll be down there on the more meadowy places where they get a little bit more sun. So there's just a bunch of variety of temperatures within that area. And I'll turn it over to Emily to talk a little.
So now we know kind of what the alpine is. So what about the plants that live in the alpine? So these are plants that live in the alpine are really specialized. We'll talk about some of their characteristics, but they've adapted to live in this really harsh environment with, as Nanette said, a really, really short growing season. It's very cold, it's very dry, it's often very windy, there's really high UV. So these plants have adapted and evolved to survive in this incredibly harsh environment. But they don't necessarily love living there. Like our garden is the highest elevation botanic garden in North America, and we're only at 8,200 feet. And we're actually able to grow a lot of alpine plants because even though they're adapted for these really, really harsh environments, living in a more cushy environment, like in Vail, they still can grow.
Which is like Florida for us.
Yeah. There are some species that are called obligate alpines, and these are ones that really can't survive not in the alpine.
I want to interrupt, but I didn't hear what you called that.
Oh, obligate.
Obligate.
Okay.
Yeah, so those are the species that like we can't grow them here in our gardens. They're not going to be, sometimes when we're talking about these different life zones, you'll actually see quite a variety of elevational, like a lot of plants can survive like 8,000 to 14,000 or 10,000 to 14,000, or even some like yarrow, you'll find from like sea level all the way up into the alpine. But then there's some that only survive in the alpine. For example, Arctic Alpine Forget-Me-Not, the Erythrachium nanum. That's one of our obligate alpines. And we'll talk about that a little later because it's one of my favorites.
Oh, I didn't know that. We can't grow it here.
Yeah,
No?
we can grow it for a little bit, but it really doesn't thrive below the alpine. So some of their alpine plant characteristics, often they're mat forming, so they form these cushions. And that's actually a really great advantage for them because they, by being so close together and making these big cushions, they can actually generate a little bit more heat. So they can kind of extend their growing time because they're a little bit warmer. Because as we talked about, photosynthesis is not very efficient below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So if any additional heat that you can get really allows you to thrive a little bit more. Often alpine plants, their flowers are similar in size to their lower elevation cousins, but then the plant itself will be really small. So you end up with these really large flowers compared to the plant overall. They're often very low growing. Again, this is partly because it takes so long to allocate carbon because photosynthesis is like, you really need to have a temperature of above 40 degrees and their growing season is so short. But they also, this is an advantage when we're talking about these really high winds, as well as like keeping a little bit warmer. And then a lot of alpine plants have texture and color adaptations that help them survive in this harsh environment. As we go through some of these plants, we'll see a lot of them have hair, or they have like a fuzzy characteristic, and that helps both with breaking up wind, so they like lose less water to like a desiccating wind, as well as helping with the really high UV radiation. So as we go through these plants, I'll kind of point out some of the characteristics that define them. All right, let's go ahead. So we're going to go through some of our common alpine plants, and especially ones that are some of our personal favorites. So on the left is the Arctic Alpine Forget-Me-Not. This is a really distinctive alpine plant. It forms a cushion, so it checks that box. It forms a cushion. It has really fuzzy leaves that are almost silvery. And again, this helps with both wind and UV. And then the flowers are this really intense blue. So you'll spot this plant from like a mile away because it's this really vivid blue, even though the plant is very small.
And it has that beautiful yellow eye, which I assume is for attracting pollinators.
Yeah, definitely. On the right, we have Old Man of the Mountain. This is a really cute alpine plant. It's a sunflower. It's in the Asteraceae family. These are really big flowers compared to the rest of their bodies. And the plant itself is very fuzzy. They're really distinctive. Often you'll find a whole field of them, but they are monocarpic. So as soon as they flower, they do die. Sometimes it'll take a long time for them to build enough energy, like years and years to build enough energy to then have a flower and then die.
Sad.
Yeah. This is Alpine Spring Beauty. This is a really beautiful alpine plant that lives in scree fields. Scree is like kind of, I guess you would say like rock slides and things like that. And so
Loose rock.
like loose rock. And so the Latin name is Claytonia megariza, and the epithet megariza means big root. And they have a giant taproot. So they really have this huge taproot that where they store a lot of their energy and a lot of their like all of this, like they photosynthesize and then they store so much of that in the taproot. And this actually goes really deep into the rock, which is really
talk
cool.
about meristems.
Oh yeah.
So one of the things about alpine plants is that they keep their growing parts, the cells that are sort of like the embryo cells in animals, down below the surface of the ground. So if that whole plant gets frozen in a bad winter storm or summer storm, yeah, who knows? Yeah,
Oh,
right.
got those.
Yeah. It can regenerate itself, and it's stored so much of its energy in that big huge root. It has the ability to regenerate, as opposed to trees. This is where tree line comes into effect, is that trees have their growing parts, their meristems, out at the ends of their stems. So, and it's up there in the wind, getting totally exposed. And of course, the leaves, the needles are very tender when they first come out. So
Mhm.
generally they get frozen off right away. And you've seen those flag trees that are right at tree line where they try to stick their head up and then that top gets frozen off and then it crawls along the ground and
Mhm.
gets set up again. So alpine plants have that ability to just keep their growing parts underground.
Yeah, a little bit safer for this harsh environment.
You want me to move on?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Here we go.
And then we have Alpine sandwort on the left. This is another cushion forming plant. This is a really cool plant and kind of a mascot of the Alpine. These flowers are very, very small. How big do you think those flowers are? Like, yeah.
Like less
Like-
than an inch across.
Yeah,
right?
like the size of like your pinky fingernail.
Mhm.
But it's a really interesting plant and these cushions are really distinctive again. And then on the right is Silky Phacelia. And this is another alpine plant that I think is just so beautiful and like very, very cheerful color. And this, you can kind of see in this picture, but the leaves are very silvery. So again, they have little tiny hairs on the leaves. And again, this helps them retain their water so they're not getting, it breaks up that desiccating wind as well as kind of protects them a little bit more from the high radiation.
And I just wanted to mention that they've done slices of the roots of the alpine sandwort and found out that these plants, they're just like tree rings,
Mhm.
live to 150 to 200 years old, even though they're just,
Yeah,
they do
they're-
spread out over
Yeah,
time,
but
but
they're
they
not
can
very
be
big.
really old.
And then we've got the Arctic gentian. This one is a really like distinctive, beautiful alpine plant. It has purple stippling. It's a little tiny purple dots that really, it makes it just really distinctive. And this comes out in the fall. It's kind of like a gentian season at the end.
Fall is September in the
Yeah,
alpine,
like
right?
August,
Yeah.
September,
Yeah, right.
fall.
Mhm.
And then we've got sky pilot. This is another pretty common alpine plant. And the Latin name Polemonium viscosum, the epithet means, viscosa means sticky. And the leaves on this are like, they're very sticky and actually quite stinky. It's like has a really like skunky odor. But that there's actually like some interesting characteristics with this plant and another similar plant called Polemonium confertum. And one of the defining characteristics is that one is pollinated by flies and one is pollinated by bees. So we've got the stinky and the sweet.
The stinky goes for ants
The
and the
ants and, like-
sweet is for the bees.
Of course it is.
And then, so these three plants are all in the family Crassulaceae. So we've got spearleaf stonecrop, queen's crown, and king's crown. And these plants are really very cool from like a physiological standpoint. So everything in the Crassulaceae family uses a process called CAM, which I think is crassulaceaing acid
Metabolism.
yeah,
or something like that.
metabolism.
Yeah.
So essentially all the plants in this genus actually photosynthesize during the day because they need the sun, but they close their pores. So the pores on a plant are called stomata. And this is where there's a lot of water transfer. So in a really dry environment like the alpine, having your stomata open in order to facilitate photosynthesis is very taxing because you're going to lose a lot of water. So these plants have actually evolved to do this process called CAM, where they actually store water in vacuoles in their leaves, so that they don't actually have to have their stomata open during the day at all. So they only open their stomata at night, which is a pretty amazing adaptation.
Yeah, and so what scientists have determined is that many of the alpine plants have probably evolved from desert plants. Most of the desert plants do CAM photosynthesis, so they don't have to open up their stomata during the day. What happens is there's a chemical that they have that's special that will then do the chemical part of photosynthesis at nighttime. And when they have to expire, they also have to give off oxygen to make it happen. But so it's pretty cool to have sort of desert plants up there in the alpine.
And then we've got some other of our really common charismatic plants. The split leaf Indian paintbrush. This is a really beautiful plant. The color ranges from like pale pink, like almost white, to like a very deep magenta. Sometimes they almost seem like they're glowing. They're so bright and beautiful. They're in the Castanea genus, which is like, I guess, hemiparasitic.
Right.
So you'll often find them kind of nestled in with other plants or sometimes on their own, but they can actually like siphon off nutrients from other plant roots. And then on the right is marsh marigold, and you'll often find this like next to alpine streams. And it's a really, really cheerful, beautiful plant. That's really nice. And then we've got Alpine avens. And so this is one of kind of our foundational alpine plants. We'll often find this in big mats, like over the landscape. And this is actually a really important plant for our American pica. So I don't know if you've ever seen a pica. Picas are a really, really cool alpine animal. They're about the size and shape of a baked potato. And they're lagomorphs. So they're related to hares, even though they look like hamsters. They're actually more related to hares and rabbits. And they don't hibernate. So these little guys live in the alpine. They live in scree and talus fields. So in those really like loose, rocky fields, they don't hibernate. So they actually collect vegetation throughout the growing season and store it in these hay piles. And one of the most common plants to find in a hay pile is Alpine avens. And which is interesting because Alpine avens actually is very high in tannins. So it has like it's like really astringent and bitter. But it turns out that over time, so throughout the winter, as these pica are still relying on the hay pile that they gather during the summer, the tannins slowly degrade in the alpine avens and makes them much more palatable. And the tannins actually help preserve some of the other plants in their hay piles so that they don't get like rotten or moldy, because they need to last the entire winter.
And one of the things about pica is that they are so well adapted to the cold, but they cannot tolerate any heat whatsoever. So, and they have to get out there and collect these plants during the summer. So another species that we need to worry about a little bit in the alpine environment.
Yeah, they like can't, I guess their hearts can't handle being like above like 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So as the alpine warms, these animals are going to be in trouble.
Our favorite alpine mascot.
Yeah. So now we've got moss campion. This is one of my personal favorites. This is another cushion plant. It's a lovely pink cushion with little tiny flowers. And this you'll find throughout the alpine. It's really, I wouldn't say it's necessarily like an obligate alpine because we do grow some of it here in the gardens, but you really don't find this below tree line out in nature. And then on the right is elephant's head. This is one of several pedicularius species in the alpine, but it's bright purple. And you'll find this in like marshy areas. So like when you find like kind of a seep or like a marshy area or next to a stream in the alpine, you'll often see elephant's head. And it's called elephant's head because the flowers actually really do look like the head of an elephant with like a little trunk coming out.
Yeah, they're cute.
They're really cool. And then this is our most newly named alpine plant. This is the funky thistle. And the reason it's newly named is until this year, this species was actually grouped together with the mountain thistle. So Cercium scopularum was kind of the blanket identification, but it turns out that there's actually two different species. There's the mountain thistle and the funky thistle. And part of the reason that this confusion happened is because some of the original specimens of thistles that were sent to Asa Gray actually to be identified.
In Harvard in the 1800s.
Yeah. When he was
Edward James.
the herbarium specimens of thistles, almost all the flowers dry brown. So it was actually really hard to tell that Cercium scopularum, the mountain thistle, the flowers are actually purple in real life. And on the funky thistle, they're yellow. And then through actually Dr. Jennifer Ackerfield, who wrote the Flora of Colorado and is currently the curator of the herbarium down at Denver Botanic Gardens. She's a really great botanist and taxonomist. She did a bunch of genetic work and confirmed that these are actually two separate species that were housed under this umbrella of the mountain thistle.
And so Emily and I have been out in the field, and they're almost always covered with bumblebees.
Oh,
They
yeah.
are obviously a favorite with lots of, I'm sure there must be a lot of pollen and nectar in
Mhm.
there. But Jennifer Ackerfield has observed them first thing in the morning. They've obviously spent the night in among all of that hair. I guess probably to keep warm. So it's
Yeah.
kind of interesting. They've got a good relationship going on there, the bees and
Yeah.
funky thistle.
And they're really distinctive because like you won't mistake this plant for anything else because it towers above other alpine plants and it has this really distinctive like nodding fuzzy head. So it's one of kind of like the exciting things to see because it's like, oh, it's new, even though it's still been there.
And it was named after Jennifer Ackerfield's mentor.
Yeah.
And her last name is Funk. but
Yeah,
I
Dr.
can't-
Vicky Funk.
Vicky
Yeah.
Funk. Okay.
So that's kind of a cool thing also. So that's kind of like, those are kind of our common alpine plants that you'll see in a lot of different alpine areas. I did want to touch on some of our high value or high conservation value alpine plants. And so these are plants that are rated G1 through G3. These global rankings, so G1 is critically imperiled, G2 is imperiled, and G3 is vulnerable. So these are species that have been identified as having really low population numbers and being in danger of going extinct. So we have several alpine plants that fall into this like high conservation value metric, including some that we've been seeing out in the field over the last couple of years, including the Alpine larkspur. So this is if you've seen like larkspur that like grows in the gardens and things like that, it's really beautiful, deep purple. The funny thing about the Alpine larkspur is the flower is like almost the same size as like a regular cultivated larkspur, but the plant itself is like this big. So you have these tiny, tiny little plants in like gigantic flowers. And it grows in like really rocky, like steep areas. We also have the Alpine nailwort. This plant may look very unassuming, but it's actually another one of those really interesting obligate alpines, only found in the alpine, really hard to grow in cultivation. And it has these tiny, tiny little yellow green flowers. And it makes these beautiful cushions. And I think it's a really beautiful, cool plant.
It feels really sort of, I don't know,
Like
dense and
spongy,
spongy.
yeah. Yeah, it's really amazing. We've got the Harbor's beard tongue. So this is one of our penstemon species. And there's actually quite a few penstemons that grow in the alpine, but this is one of our more rare ones. This is rated G3, so this is vulnerable. And this, I've only seen it twice, and it's really, really beautiful and distinctive. And it has, the leaves are almost like a blue-green color, which is distinctive. And then I wanted to feature some of our endemic plants. So endemic means that they're only found in one place. So these are some that are endemic to Colorado, although I guess possibly not to Surya. I guess there's some debate about that. All of these plants are found in the mosquito range, so not far from where we are actually. The Weber's sawwort is, again, a very distinctive alpine plant. It's in the Asteraceae family. And it's like a really fuzzy, it makes a really fuzzy head with a bunch of compound flowers. The Hoosier Pass Ipomopsis, this is one of my favorites. I say that about all the plants, but this actually is one of my favorites.
Lots of favorites.
This plant is endemic actually to the mosquito range. So you really don't see this anywhere else except here in the mosquito range. And it's really fragrant. So it has these giant flower balls, and it has like a really amazing smell. Well, some people like it. Some people think it doesn't smell good. So
I have to get down on my hands and knees next time.
Check it out. And then we've got the Alpine bladderpod. So this is another pretty distinctive alpine plant that is endemic to Colorado. And we've actually been doing some work with our colleagues down at Denver Botanic Gardens with some experimental warming chambers for the Alpine bladderpod and the Weber's sawwort. So we'll see how those go. And so then I wanted to talk about the alpine strategy. So we talked about what is the alpine and some of our really distinctive alpine plants. And as Nanette mentioned, the alpine is really threatened by climate change. The alpine is warming more quickly than other terrestrial ecosystems. And the reason that this is concerning is So many of these alpine plants live in the alpine, not because they love living in this really harsh environment, but because that's where they don't have the competition from other plants. But as the alpine warms, we're expecting to see more lower elevation plants moving into higher elevation areas and outcompeting our alpine plants, which are super well adapted to a harsh environment, but not as well adapted to outcompeting other
Yeah, they
plants.
grow very slowly and they're close to the ground. And so you can see that plants coming up from lower elevations can just overshadow them very easily and suck up all the nutrients.
Yeah. And, here in Colorado, like our alpine, it pretty much only goes to like 14,000 feet. There's really not that much area that these alpine plants can escape to.
Yeah, 11,200 to 14,000. That's all the space that they have to live in.
So you can imagine that as these areas are warming, we're very concerned about alpine plants and the animals that depend on them as well. So in 2020, we published the North American Botanic Garden Strategy for Alpine Plant Conservation. That's a little bit of a mouthful, so we call it the Alpine Strategy. And we published this with our partners at Denver Botanic Gardens. And we're very excited to be leading the implementation of this strategy. And this kind of guides our conservation work. So this is pretty much what my job is.
And very much my job too.
Yeah, exactly. And the Alpine strategy is made up of 12 targets within 4 objectives. And let's give you a brief outline of each of the objectives. We don't have to go through each one line by line. But the first objective is to understand and document alpine plant diversity. We need to know what's there if we're going to conserve it. So this is, under this objective, we made a digital map of all of the alpine areas in North America. We're also putting together a list of all of the alpine plants in North America. And this list is really important because it's like, well, if we can't name them, how are we going to conserve them? Right now, there's about 2,500 species. We've been combing through the literature as well as various like flora and field guides and talking to people. So it's been a really interesting effort, but I think we're near the finish line. So I'm pretty excited to have this like comprehensive list of all the alpine plants in North America. We also assess the land designations, land management designations for alpine areas. So do these alpine areas fall within a wilderness area, or are they on BLM land, or are they private, or is there a trail that's being proposed to go right through a rare population? Like these are all things that are really important for us to know as we're trying to conserve these alpine areas. And our second objective is then conserving alpine plants and their habitats. So this includes ex situ and in situ conservation goals. Ex situ means off-site. So this is when we do conservation like seed banking or collecting seeds to grow these alpine plants in our collections in case anything happened to these populations in the wild. And in situ means on-site. So this is things like making sure that that we're not building a road right through an alpine population, or that these alpine areas fall within like a wilderness area or some other protection. And then we also, this objective also looks at some of our threatened species. So we talked a little bit about the high conservation value species. So having specific goals about their conservation. And then our third objective, I'll let you talk about the third objective.
Oh, the third objective is my life, which is promoting awareness of the alpine ecosystem and plant diversity through education and outreach. And that's one of the reasons that we really love the fact that the RMSBA is interested in what we're doing, and getting the word out through your illustrations to people to promote the alpine environment and the conservation work we're doing.
Yeah, we're really excited. So thank you for inviting us to do this talk. And then the fourth objective is capacity building. So this includes things like building a network. And so we're actually right now in the middle of designing our Alpine Strategy Network. We have a new website coming. Also things like we got funding to have a conservation intern. So kind of, educating that next generation of alpine scientists. This all kind of falls into our capacity building.
And that also say collaboration with your group is really good for us for building capacity too.
Yeah, definitely. And so we did want to highlight that. So we're so excited to talk to you today and happy to answer any questions about plants. But if you want to see these plants in the wild, we have a field trip planned with you guys at Loveland Pass on July 21st. And this is going to be at an alpine lake. The nice thing is that it's really accessible. You don't have to hike into the alpine. So one of the rare sites where you don't have to
Yeah, you can drive right up there.
Thank you for that.
Walk along the lake. I mean, there is a little bit of a rough, there right over here is a little bit rough,
Yeah.
but we can just do kind of this loop right here.
Yeah. This is actually a really great site because there's a ton of alpine plant diversity. It's really beautiful.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we're pretty excited. Yeah, and so that's it for us. If you have any questions, like, we'd love to answer them now. If you have any questions about the alpine strategy or the alpine plant specifically, or the alpine concept, we'd be happy to answer them now.
Well, this just answers my question. I wanted to know where the Alpine strategy was available, but it's right there.
Yeah, you can scan this. It's also on the Betty Ford Alpine Gardens website. So, and Betty Ford Alpine Gardens website's really easy to find because you just Google Betty Ford Alpine Gardens. And
there it is.
Yes, and we both of us have the longest email address possible.
But it's our names at bettyfordalpinegardens.org. So if you have any questions that come up later, feel free to email us.
Well, I think this has been a fantastic presentation.
I agree.
There are a lot of questions, but I have to do some research before I can even ask them.
Okay.
This has really stimulated me to want to draw these plants. And you talked about there are approximately 10,000 plants in this area. How many of them are in Colorado?
So I think there's about 10,000 worldwide.
Uh-huh.
In North America, there's about 2,500.
About 2,500. Okay.
Yeah. And in Colorado, fewer than that.
Yeah, but I don't really know. I don't.
Yeah.
Well, you have the plant list. So.
I know.
Emily,
If you
want to
always
You do.
I can contact you if you're interested.
That we can look at.
Yeah, actually, that's a great idea. I will pull a list of Colorado alpines if you're interested and send it around.
She has already.
Yes, very much.
She's put together a very good list of the rare and endangered, but not.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I would like to concentrate on the rare and endangered, but I would really like to see both plant lists.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I know, because you guys did two exhibits already on rare and endangered. I think of course they weren't all alpines, but
No.
maybe I think we are trying to. We have two exhibits that'll be happening this summer: an outdoor and an indoor exhibit. And the outdoor exhibit is. When we first were going to talk about it, it was the Disappearing Alpine, but it was the education committee that I work with said, everybody's getting tired of the bad news. So we're going to celebrate. We're going to celebrate the Alpine. So although we have featured plants and animals that are rare in the Alpine, we want to kind of think about the entire ecosystem. So I think for you as an organization, don't just focus on the rare and endangered. There's the rest of those flowers. And, in the end, it is possible that these rare and endangered are really possibly just not strong enough to be able to survive. And it will be those other plants that are going to be the backbone of the Alpine in the end.
So, it's the survival of the fittest, so, but I want to be able to say, I drew this plant, it's no longer in existence 50 years from now, but it was then,
Okay.
Yeah, I would say
Yeah.
the thing that I'm anticipating being a challenge with that is a lot of these rare plants, they're actually very hard to find. So depending on where you want to, like whether you want to draw it from life, which I imagine you generally do.
Yeah, I did Visaria alpina. That was the first
Mm.
botanical drawing that I ever did.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it was cool because, the botanist I was with said they had never seen another one. So it was
Oh,
really
wow.
fun to draw that thing.
Well, I think it'll be really fun. If you all of you, if you come to Pass Lake and
Mhm.
actually get to see some of these plants blooming, they may really
Mhm.
inspire you. For
Yeah.
instance, I guess one of my favorite plants are the Alpine willows, because
Mhm.
they are, of course, you've seen these huge willows everywhere,
Yeah.
but they are so tiny, but they have these huge catkins on them. It took
Yeah.
me a while to figure out what they were, but willows surprisingly are an amazing source of nectar and pollen right in the beginning of the season when the bumblebees first come out, the queen bumblebees that have overwintered, when they first come out from under the ground. And they need to build up their strength and get ready for laying their eggs and raising a brood. The willows are the things that they go to because they are there. So
Yeah.
they've become one of my favorites.
Yeah.
Very maybe not beautiful, but
They are beautiful.
definitely
They're not as
extremely
showy.
functional.
Yeah.
Yes. So you may be inspired by different characteristics of the plant rather than just their
Mhm.
outrageous color or whatever.
But there are some beautiful plants and there's some not so beautiful ones that are really interesting.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, I really appreciate you doing this. I'm going to look at it again and again because I just think it's a great presentation. And I want to encourage everybody from RMSBA to go to Pass Lake and see these beautiful flowers up close.
Yeah, being in the Alpine is a unique experience. And to be able to get to it without having to climb a mountain is kind of nice. And we will pass on some more specific information, directions to
Mhm.
Dorothy, maybe, so that you can pass it on to your members.
Yeah,
And
I'll post that stuff on the blog. So Dorothy,
Okay.
if you'll send me a copy when you get it.
Yeah, I will. I'm
Okey doke.
looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
You're
Well,
very
thank
welcome.
you. Yeah, we love talking about the Alpine. So thank you for this opportunity.
And we really appreciate that you shared some of your beautiful artwork with us for now a couple of displays, and
Mhm.
we're hoping that you'll put together something on the Alpine that we
I'm
also
really
show.
looking forward to it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.